Well, welcome everyone to Contagious Connections, Epidemic Disease in the Vast Early Americas. I'm Claire Guarini. I'm an assistant professor of history at Fordham University. And along with my colleague and co-convener, Ryan Kajnanapur, who is an assistant professor of history and Latin American studies at the University of Arizona, we'd love to thank everyone for coming to today's audience, and especially our speakers for committing their time and collective brain power to our roundtables. This is approximately, I think, 15, maybe 18 months in the making. So thank you for committing so long ago and sticking with it as we worked out the various kinks of this. Today's roundtable is the completion of our portion of the Contagious Connect, of one portion of our programming for the Contagious Connection series that has been sponsored by the Omohundro Institute. And today's discussion is part of a larger research agenda that is focused on infectious diseases in the early Americas that we are going to discuss here with our conveners. So the format for our discussion, this is a 90-minute block. We'll begin today with a moderated discussion based on pre-circulated questions that the speakers in this series that we all collectively that we developed collectively over the past couple of months. And that portion will last approximately 50 minutes. And then we will open up the Q&A in the chat. If you could just mute yourselves and then put the questions in the chat box, that would be great. And that will take place at approximately 1:30. While we're talking about these roundtable questions, participant speakers should feel free to jump in with questions or comments as they like. Audience can post member questions in the chat that we'll be answering around 1:30. And then stay tuned we're gonna put together a list of resources and bibliographic materials that'll go up on the OI website with further reading suggestions and possibly primary source suggestions. Okay, so just as a brief introduction to the program and then to our speakers, and then we'll move on to our discussion. Infectious diseases were a foundational force in the early history of the Americas and the larger Atlantic world. From smallpox to typhus in the 16th century to yellow fever and malaria in the 18th, outbreaks of disease were a recurring event in the early modern Americas. Periodically, some diseases erupted as unpredictable, terrifying, and well-documented events. And these tended to capture the attention of elite medical officials who named and defined them. At other times, they simmered as endemic, even everyday conditions that were experienced by the lowest levels of society. Yet the comparative analysis of infectious disease across time and place has often been restricted by the regional and temporal priorities of different subfields, as well as the disciplines in which we work. But infectious diseases knew no such boundaries. They moved across spaces through human, animal, and aerial pathways. Now, the importance of understanding the deep and widespread nature of disease is not a new venture. In fact, Noah Webster, the American lexicographer and lay observer, wrote of who was watching the 1793 yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia, lamented the fact that very few scholars of his day studied the long history of the movement and origins of this type of illness. Quote, in regards to the origins and causes of pestilence, the subject is not understood, unquote. And there are other snippets that we can get from historical observers. We can understand the consequences of either studying some diseases and not studying others. The racialization of some infectious diseases, the idea that yellow fever afflicted whites primarily, for example, meant that enslaved people's arsenal of strategies for coping with tropical fevers were overlooked and ignored. Much has been written, the St. Vincent slaveholder, David Collins summarized, about the diseases of climate. But, he continued, their rules of treatment are much more applicable to the condition of whites who have all the advantages of good nursing and medical attendance than do our slaves who possess none of them, at least in equal degree. Such an insight was only enabled by enslaved people who had long developed their own strategies to cope with infectious fevers. And when they refused to consume the harsh purgative cinchona cures inflicted upon them by colonists, they highlighted, at considerable risk to their own personhood, that overworked and underfed bodies required less violent interventions. So although much has changed since Webster's and Collins' era, the need to explore the importance of epidemic disease in the early Americas remains. In fact, our current and never-ending experience with the pandemic turned endemic of COVID-19 serves as an ongoing reminder about the importance of understanding the history of infectious disease. So in this program, or this series of programs, Contagious, that we're calling Contagious Connections, we aim to address some of these issues, and there is no better place to think about the vast early Americas than the Omohundro Institute. So these series of roundtables aim to talk across imperial and disciplinary divides, moving us out of our respective silos to broaden our approaches and methods. And we hope to highlight the importance of understanding diseases as experiential occurrences and epistemological forces as well. And so we're really interested here today to think about the biological way that the biological phenomenon intersects with sociocultural experiences, what Charles Rosenberg considered as a disease as frame approach. So I can't think of a better group of people to discuss these issues than the scholars we've assembled here today. They work in a wide variety of arenas and regions, and I will introduce them to you now briefly before we move on to our discussion. Seth Archer is an assistant professor at Utah State University. He is a cultural and environmental historian of North America, specializing in Native American and Indigenous history and the history of health, disease, and medicine. His first book, Sharks Upon the Land, Colonialism, Indigenous Health, and Culture in Hawaii, 1778 to 1855, won the President's Book Award from the Social Science History Association. From 2015 to 2017, he was the Mellon Research Fellow in American History at the University of Cambridge. And his current research involves vaccination efforts by the US government and the Hudson's Bay Company in Indian country in the 1830s. Erica Charters is a historian of disease, war, and empires. She is professor of the global history of medicine at the University of Oxford, where she is also the director of Oxford's Center for the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology, and co-director of Oxford Center for Global History. She has published on the history of colonial medicine, as well as the history of imperial war and its relationship to disease. Her publications include the monograph, Disease, War, and the Imperial State, and a spotlight journal on the history of epidemics in the context of COVID-19, which is excellent. And she is currently coordinating a multidisciplinary project, How Epidemics End. Rana Hogarth is an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research focuses on the creation of ideas about racial difference in North America and the Caribbean as they emerge through the language of medicine and its allied fields. She is the author of Medicalizing Blackness, Making Racial Difference in the Atlantic World, 1780 to 1840. Her book examines how white physicians define Blackness as a medically significant marker of difference in the slave societies of the American Atlantic. Her other publications appear in Social History of Medicine, American Quarterly, African and Black Diaspora and International Journal, the American Journal of Public Health, and in the edited volume, Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery. James Rice is the Walter S. Dickinson Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Tufts University. His publications include Nature and History in the Potomac Country, From Hunter-Gatherers in the Age of Jefferson, Tales from the Revolution, Bacon's Rebellion and the Transformation of Early America, and Bacon's Rebellion in Indian Country, winner of the Binkley-Stephenson Award for the best article published in the Journal of American History in 2014. He is currently working on 2 books, Founding Massacres, Violence, Ambitions, and the Birth of Virginia, and Native America, an Environmental History. Cristobal Silva is an associate professor in the Department of English at UCLA, where he specializes in the literatures of the colonial Americas. He is the author of Miraculous Plagues, an epidemiology of early New England narrative, which explores the relationship between colonial epidemiology and the stories of colonial belonging that English settlers told themselves. He is currently finishing a manuscript titled Republic of Medicine, a study of immunology, medical knowledge, and the 18th century Atlantic slave trade. So welcome to our speakers, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about what we're going to learn. So I thought that to start, we would think really broadly and ask, in what ways does your research on epidemics help us understand sickness, not only during major outbreaks of disease, but also in everyday experience? That's for everyone.
Well, I guess I'll start us off on that, because that question really is a good one for my book, because I spend a fair amount of time in my book investigating the knock-on effects of introduced infectious diseases in Hawaii, especially changes in fertility, infant mortality, and lifespan. Each of those three changes in turn affected island religion, labor and economy, family life and relations between men and women, the hereditary monarchy, and even Hawaiian sovereignty, as I argue. And just to give an example of that, by the mid-19th century, across the Hawaiian Islands, deaths outnumbered births in many, many districts by an order of 2 to 1. So that was 70 years after Captain Cook arrived. And so I think historians have probably done a better job investigating the everyday experiences of people stemming from the various efforts by authorities to control disease than disease itself. And so I do see my book as providing a bit of the latter. I'll stop there.
Okay, James, did you want to comment on the epidemics and their role in helping us see the experience of everyday sickness?
Yeah, I can do it. I think one of the things that I would stress for people who are working on mainland North America is something that people who work in the Caribbean and the South Atlantic in general and Pacific are very used to, is the critical importance of endemic diseases, and particularly malaria, which is typically understood in studies of the Eastern Seaboard with reference to Black and white, but not to Indigenous people. And of course, it's harder to trace in the records, but there's no reason to believe that the transit of malaria, for example, through a given region, which can be very slow just because of mosquitoes can't fly very far. It takes a long time to spread, but I mean, that transit, there's no reason to believe that that affects only people of European and African origin and not people who are immediately adjacent to them. So it's also an interesting question of a silence in the archives and how comfortable we are of drawing those connections in the absence of direct testimony and written records.
Can I? Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead, Erica. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, because in some ways I think maybe it picks up on what James just said, because one of the things that of course has struck me throughout being someone who works on the history of disease, and in some ways I think I've worked more on endemic disease than epidemic disease, and this notion that of course epidemics are dramatic, and so when you're living through one, you're aware of this kind of notion of urgency and of a crisis, and how in many ways of course that obscures the nature of endemic disease, but it's very hard in the historical record to understand epidemic disease without also understanding the patterns of endemic disease. And so it's struck me how there's this kind of fundamental historical tension and also a kind of maybe even a biological tension between this notion of epidemics as being these universal, the way Rosenberg talks about them, right? So that you can see them all throughout time, they're comparable, and they're a drama that plays out, and then how many of us actually are working on things like endemic disease, which are much harder to capture, and also then trying to pin down what's distinct and unique about the different historical periods. So it strikes me that it's in many ways, I keep rethinking categorization that I've been using in my own work and wondering if I should have questioned things more. So just as James is saying, also thinking about what's not captured in the archives and in the records and in people's attention, but yet is so crucial.
I was just going to add something that James had brought up just about thinking about Indigenous bodies. In my own work, looking at like yellow fever, for example, I do know that, you know, there'll be that sort of aside where they will say, okay, the groups that are susceptible, and at times they will say Indians, or they will say Misties, which could be a mixed race person. And so they were kind of lumped in with Europeans as being vulnerable, which is interesting and something that, you know, I wish I had more knowledge and like time to sort of properly address, because there are a lot of questions about which bodies belong and which bodies are meant for certain environments. And so it always struck me as sort of like, okay, well, if Indigenous people are considered to be somehow very vulnerable in the same way that newcomers, whites are, but what does that actually mean? And then there are like Africans who are just like sort of robust in kind of in certain discourse. So I'm thinking primarily of like middle to late 18th century. John Lining actually, in his list of people who are likely or liable to the yellow fever, he lists, just as an aside, Indigenous people and mulattoes, so mixed race Black and white people, Misties, but then he says, okay, but the Negroes are not. So I think that kind of going back and carefully tracing like assumptions about the specific groups in terms of their belonging and sort of what they signified based on sort of knowing that they were of mixed ancestry, and then recognizing how that might play into existing narratives about which bodies belong in which environments, because diseases are, of course, often very much linked to the environment. This is a place that is prone to such and such disease, or so that's something that I'm really glad that James had flagged as sort of something to think about more, and something that, again, I wish that I had maybe had more time to kind of fully parse how Indigenous bodies kind of do end up as in part of these laundry lists of who can and who can't, and maybe what that means.
Yeah, I think these has all been really helpful observations, especially about pinpointing that perceived differences between bodies. I'm actually, one of the things that interests me is being a literature person who kind of is in a department, but also feels not really in a department. People look at me and say, why are you here, not in a history department? I'm sure if I was in a history department, they'd say, why are you here, not in English department? But one of the things I've found over my career happening increasingly, and I think even more insistently since the pandemic has begun, was to keep thinking to myself and asking myself the fundamental question of what medicine means. Like, what do I mean by medicine? And, you know, it's a question that I've taken for granted for years and years and years, but sort of said, okay, I have to stop. And I've come for myself with an absurdly broad, but I think helpful definition, that medicine is a system for understanding the relations between individuals, communities, and the worlds in which they live, right? So it's nothing about illness, about contagion, but it is about, we can think about framing, about narrative, any ways we can. And for me, that definition invites us to consider medicine across cultures, regions, and historical eras without prejudging the forms or modes that it should take, right? So without doing the thing that I think we're all really careful about doing is imposing modern epidemiological and immunological models on the 18th century. And so I think this is, for me, has been really helpful over the last 4 or 5 years in thinking about, I mean, before the pandemic, but acceleratedly since then, sort of thinking about my relation to the field, my relation to medicine. And then I would say the other thing, and this is what the pandemic has really, really emphasized for me, is to think about medicine increasingly also about caregiving and caregiving practices, right? When we think about whether it's our families, our colleagues, or our students especially, and this is especially the case at UCLA, is the burdens of caregiving on them, right? Often the things that aren't visible to us. And this, I think, is a deep ethical question in terms of the work that we do, and sort of imagining how we go to the archives. And James had mentioned kind of that silence or that invisibility in the archives that I think we're always trying to get at and get toward.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there in the responses. So I'm hearing things about, there's many different ways this could go right now. We can address all of them in time, just figuring out which ones to go first. I'm hearing things about the problems of the archive, right? And silence of the archive, and how do you wring information mostly about subaltern groups from things that are written about them by elite men in power. And then there's this question about, this recurring question about bodies belonging in certain environments and the way that relates to sovereignty and capacity for self-determination once bodies are forcibly displaced from those environments, or other claims are made about the sort of naturalization of other groups of bodies in that environment. And then I think, you know, and this comes back to Seth's and Christabel's thing, is the ways in which illness and healing and can coincide with displacement to either disrupt or affirm effective ties between people that are solidified and reaffirmed in caregiving and care work. So that's a bunch of stuff I just threw on the table. I guess I'd like to push a little further on this question about bodies and environment and who gets to make those claims. And then how do subalterns press back on claims made by people who are trying to displace them, and what the effects of that are for people sustaining, as Seth was pointing out, sovereignty and familial communities, or family ties too.
I mean, I'll try and take a stab at it in terms of thinking about like bodies and belonging in the environment. I mean, what I always think about is, I always go back to Joyce Chaplin's subject matter, where there's this idea of like early English settlers are trying to parse indigenous bodies and sort of saying, okay, well, they are vulnerable and they're sort of weakened in some ways, even though that's their environment, right? So the English are settling in this space and are kind of positioning themselves in a way to say, okay, we are able to adapt. Of course, we fall prey to certain diseases, but and then Africans end up being really sturdy, indigenous people being weak. Like, it's kind of a clear manipulation of sort of the idea of belonging that's clearly based on sort of obvious, desires for land, for settlement, et cetera. But I always have been curious about ways in which you have like sort of an outside group suggesting they know the natural order of things, like in a new space, and kind of using what they are observing with disease and environment as kind of a way to like sort of buttress some of these ideas. I again don't know sort of off the top of my head of ways in which indigenous or sort of subaltern groups in that regard, in that context, like necessarily push back. I do always think though of the case of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. If we flash forward to 1793, that was like, that's a rare case where you have a subaltern group that pushes back when, they say, everyone told us we were not going to get yellow fever, and that's not true. And part of me, had always wanted to maybe dig into that and sort of frame that as a kind of, actually a sort of way of gesturing towards empiricism. The idea that they are saying, based on our observations and based on us doing that methodical, looking at bodies and looking at the death count and using our experience in this way, can't we sort of, think of that pamphlet as being in dialogue with texts that I would actually argue circulate in a similar time that say, well, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. I was actually there. I'm an expert. Like, there's this tension between some of these like elite learned physicians. And so I think, gosh, how interesting would it have been for me to sort of actually try to read Absalom Jones and Richard Allen's text, their account of yellow fever, which is not necessarily a medical text, but it certainly does offer insights into expertise, authority, and knowledge from a sort of oppressed group, saying, okay, this is our experience with the disease, and this is actually directly challenging what everyone who's an expert said, and kind of seeing how that works. Because I can think of a number, we can think of a number of Anglo physicians that might say, oh, this person is a fool. I know yellow fever. They don't know what it is. And they're able to argue and have that kind of pamphlet discussion or treatise discussion. And it's like between these learned groups. And I wonder what happens when we start to add in these kinds of sources that, I mean, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen is very easy, right? That's not a silence in their archive. They actually printed it. It's there. So it's very handy to have. But I think going down that avenue of trying to think about ways in which either reading it against the grain or reading between the lines of saying, okay, is this a case of subaltern groups or those that are oppressed trying to say that's incorrect, right? Even in the decision to use a kind of therapy or to be non-compliant, to sort of say, this is our way of saying we have our own knowledge and what you're telling us does not comport with what our experience is. But this is a great question. I'm curious to see what others have to say.
You know, as Rana was speaking, I was thinking of Jennifer Morgan's Reckoning with Slavery. And there are a lot of ways to read that book, but, you know, one big takeaway for me is that, you know, statistics are a way of telling a story that allows enslavers to do what they do, in the same way that soldiers are reluctant to actually fire directly at the opposition and shoot into trees. It's a way of dehumanizing and so forth. And, you know, I think on the face of it, stories about weak Indigenous bodies are also a narrative. It's a bit of firsting and lasting that goes on there. But it made me think that, you know, in Indigenous communities that I'm familiar with and, today, there are two ways of thinking about epidemics in the past, and it's usually about epidemics and not endemic disease. And one is broadly political, but the other is when it comes down to talking about their own specific communities' histories. People are very interested in when an epidemic happened and how that intersected with their relationships with other groups, with other First Nations, with colonizers, and so forth. And so one, you know, I don't know if you call this pushback, but it's a construction of a community-specific narrative that accounts for that community's history, which is also, I think, another way of claiming that distinctiveness, right? We're not Native people, we're not Indigenous, we are specifically Akwesasne or Piscataway or whatever. So.
Yeah, just to push on this a little bit more. I mean, it strikes me that in both Rana and James's responses is it's like texts that are not explicitly natural texts or scientific texts are like a really good way. And so, you know, these are sort of narratives about who we are and where we came from. Is that true? Have you guys found that in your work, that texts that you would not imagine to speak to the relationship of illness, the quotidian dimensions of illness, are actually speaking to it quite a bit in these narratives then around which community is sort of self-defined and reconstituted?
Yeah, non-medical texts. Yes, I think that, I'm sure we'll talk about methods, but one thing that I have been trying to do more of, because I've like trained as a historian of medicine, so it's like, oh, okay, medical texts first, but really to get at not those elites, to see sort of where conversations and pushback is happening. It is actually either interesting to read the footnotes in those treatises where there claims to be, this is a funny story of what these people are doing. And I'm like, okay. And then, but then also to think about in terms of actions, advertisements, in terms of, you know, like other fragments that exist that are not a cohesive, easily presented to you text. I think those are really valuable. I think it requires a lot of work with them because you don't want to like add to it, you know what I mean? You don't want to read too much into it. That's something that as historians, we have to like kind of restrain ourselves, especially with subjugated and marginalized groups. We all want to see like, aha, they're getting the best of it, but we have to be careful. So I do find them to be, these kinds of fragments to be extremely useful, but I think we have to work with them with great care.
I would I agree with that. I think that was a wonderful comment. And just to come back to, I think for me, that's why I've moved toward that broader definition of medicine. In other words, it allows us to pay attention, be attentive to the stories people tell. And I think Absalom Jones and Richard Allen are a wonderful example of that. And I would just sort of say in response to Rana's question is well, two things. First, I think especially with yellow fever, this is where modern kind of medical models is really powerful, is to be really precise with ourselves about when yellow fever was pandemic, when yellow fever was epidemic, and when and where all of those, and when and where it was endemic, because all of those determine very precisely the differing and changing immunological patterns throughout the Atlantic world, and especially around you know, the immunity or non-immunity of European bodies, of African bodies, of Indigenous bodies. And so I would though the Saint-Domingue is quite different, or Haiti is quite different from Philadelphia, I think sort of knowledge about yellow fever in Haiti, specifically in and around the revolution, I think is a powerful counterpoint through which to think about the experience, especially in Philadelphia, but throughout the eastern seaboard of the United States, of Black and African American bodies, or African American people with yellow fever.
Yeah, I'm struck by the way that they're struck by two things about the ways in which history of medicine and history of infectious diseases and the history of slavery and counting has sort of mirrored the historiography of medicine and infectious diseases in the early modern Americas is mirroring a similar fatigue that historians of slavery are having, which is embodied by Jennifer Morgan's book, with just using the quantitative archive on its surface, and just for us using biological and virological approaches to disease. There's a sort of fatigue with that because it works at a scale and at assumptions that it strikes me that this group is particularly interested in the local or maybe the regional or at a sort of smaller scale with, but you know, then there are also sort of bigger global approaches to disease as well, or larger, you know, where a lot of us come to this as Atlanticist. And so maybe it would be helpful to think about the ways that the local intersects, not with the universal certainly, but with larger regional scales of study and how that's accomplished, or if you work on that.
I wonder if one way of thinking about this, partly, so I was thinking about mobility, because so I work on soldiers and sailors, and of course, when we were talking about this issue of disease, especially when disease becomes a problem in terms of when something becomes an epidemic, and there's obviously a point about mobility, so populations being out of place or people being out of place as much as it is about the specific bodies, and of course, people being able to early on tie this to disease spread, and so I've been very struck by how of course if you work on the history of disease, you're necessarily already thinking about mobility as a you know, this is the only way that you can kind of understand the movement, which tends, I think, to think about especially the Atlantic world in these different ways. But it also makes me think about social history, because I've been struck again how I think many ways in which I'm interested in using, say, political sources, but thinking about disease as times when actually political authority is vulnerable. And so in some ways it's a very traditional thing to be a social historian of medicine and to think about disease, because it kind of opens up these cracks. It's exactly when you can see that authorities don't have control over, say, the movement of their populations, don't have control in various other ways. So I you know, there's a kind of pleasure in seeing when it is that that these systems are ambitious rather than tangible, at least for many parts of the period that I look at and many of the sources that I read.
And I'll just echo Cristobal's and Rana's point about precision being just so essential to this kind of work. And Cristobal's book, you know, 10 years, 12 years ago, whenever it was I first read that, it was part of what inspired me to think about Hawaii as a place where I actually could get my hands around what might be happening, because the Atlantic world is just so insanely complicated. The mobility alone, and which is not to say that Hawaii is not complicated, but that striving for precision, I think, is really critical to be able to tell the story that you want to tell. And frankly, what the world's going through right now might inspire the opposite. That is, we're all dealing with COVID-19. You know, assumptions that it probably looks the same everywhere, which of course, as we know, it does not, right? And so I think there are pressures that mitigate against precision in this kind of scholarship, and we need to be mindful of that, I guess.
Yeah, I'm struck by both in Erica and Seth, your work, and the ways in which, like Erica's point, that people are moving around in places, and that makes authorities very nervous. And there's this insistence on sort of pushing down, wanting order, like that they expose the disorder and that like in turn engenders a big push for top-down impositions of orderliness. I'm not really sure whether there's a question there, but it's just an observation about sort of the disorder, the tension between order, disorder, and the ways that that manifests in very particular times and places while people are moving on around and through them. And I wonder if there is a way in which have any interdisciplinary approaches helped you, have any of you borrowed interdisciplinary approaches to resolve some of these tensions, both between the global and the local, movement, frames of analysis, whether it's Atlantic or Pacific worlds, or working with sources that, you know, as we said before, don't necessarily, you wouldn't think on the surface have anything to do with people's understanding of health, sickness, and community, but actually do when you apply a different approach to them that's outside of your own field.
I could say a general point, which is like, it's a kind of still in the observational stage, which, and this partly comes from the project that I'm doing right now on how epidemics end, and my interest in thinking about the history of measurement more broadly, especially in the early modern period, when people use numbers, when they don't. One of the things I've been struck by is actually when disciplines do not measure the same things, and how important that might be, because it has struck me that if you're someone who works on the history of disease, during a pandemic, you get asked all sorts of interesting questions, like, you know, predicting what's going to happen. And it strikes me it's a very interesting point to kind of pin down what actually is your view of disease as a historian, right? So what is a kind of humanities perspective on it? And it has struck me that the human experience, right, which we've all been talking about, is so crucial. And it's not to be taken for granted that, of course, I think there's an interesting point that when the epidemic is happening, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on thinking about disease as a biological phenomenon. We understand the public health dimension, but it's really struck me that, of course, so much of at least the historical work I've been interested in has been thinking through, what does it mean within a society? What does it mean as a kind of, what does it do to communities? What does it do within a cultural framework, which is a very different understanding of disease than often is discussed. And yet to me, seems completely fundamental if you're going to understand the kind of long-term impact and the unfolding of some kind of disease outbreak or disease crisis, or even responses to it. So on the one hand, I was thinking it's a kind of sharpening, I think, of what I often think about. What does it mean to be a humanities scholar on a topic that is usually assumed to be a scientific topic? So I feel like it's sharpened that, and in some ways it's kind of helped me think about how actually that's quite useful, right? It might be useful to say we measure different things and we're interested in different things, and therefore we should actually be discussing these together, because it might be that we have very different interpretations.
I think that might also be the fault line between medicine and public health, right? You know, if nothing else, the last couple of years have really sharpened that distinction for us. And so, you know, as a literature professor, I will right up front say none of my work will ever resolve any scientific question about COVID-19, and I'm not interested. Like, people who are really good at that, and they should be doing that. I should not be doing that. However, public health is something entirely other than that, right? And it is at the intersection of science, of social science, of the physical sciences, social science, and of narrative, of the humanities. And that, I think, is particularly acute, and to be attentive. And so one of the things we can contribute is lessons on how to be attentive to the stories that people tell, right? So over the past, since the vaccine has come out, right, one of the big crises, epistemological crises, if you will, has been about vaccination and anti-vaccination and things like that. And I'm going to preface this by saying I have zero patience for non-vaccination. However, I think it is dangerous to assume that people who don't get vaccinated are anti-vaxxers in the most the biggest caricature of what that is, and that there are many reasons why people have not been and are not being vaccinated, and that in fact being a conspiracy theorist about Western medicine is actually a rational thing, right? And it's especially a rational thing if you are not, working in the academy. It's especially a rational thing if you are a person of color. It's especially a rational thing if you have been, in a colonized, you've grown up in a colonized space. And I think that the more we can press on that and listen to, why people are conspiracists, or why people don't get vaccinated, or why people don't make certain health decisions, the more powerfully we can speak to that. And that, I think, is where our fields come together and can have a powerful influence in public health.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm going to be really optimistic and ambitious and say I think even in the field of medicine, just as a sense of like, I have at least been in more conversations since this pandemic started with physicians than I ever thought I would be. I was pre-med. I'm like, okay, I feel like I'm talking to as many physicians as maybe I would have if I had stuck with that path. But the issue is that what I really hope for, I don't know that I'm successful at it, but is to try and translate and like sort of understand some of the language that maybe we in the humanities like use and deploy to talk about systems of power in medicine, particularly dealing with marginalized groups, that for actual clinicians, they're not seeing it that way. So I think specifically of the objectification of the body and the reduction of the patient to the parts, right? So what is it? It's sort of not what's the matter with you, where does it hurt? So it's localized, it's the lesion, it's that thing, and that's what I'm interested in. And that is sort of part of training, where it's like, rather than having the patient tell you, yeah, you take a patient history, but when it comes down to sort of assessing what's wrong with you, it can seem like the patient falls out of it and it's just about, I want to discover this, especially when we think about innovation and research and the idea that we're supposedly getting better all the time. And I always like to think of this as, if you were talking about groups of people who have rarely been seen as human, like their humanity is not up front, if you kind of look at it and just say, okay, I just want to see what's wrong with you and I want to cure you, one, you're talking about a difference between cure and well-being, which is also something we brush up against in doing this kind of work, right? So when a physician says, I've cured this slave of such and such disease, I'm like, yeah, you don't actually care about their well-being. You've bled and puked and purged them, and you've horrified them and perhaps traumatized their bodies in the attempt to effect a specific cure that necessarily meets your ends and not the well-being of that human who you are attempting to make feel better. And so I think that in talking to physicians, and saying, okay, do you see yourselves in your patients? This is particularly more the case of teaching hospitals in maybe areas where the practitioner lives somewhere far, far away and does not know the community, does not know the patient population, does not see themselves in the patient population, to even kind of have that dialogue and that discourse with clinicians to say, when they're saying, I just want to do my job, why are people saying there's systemic racism in medicine? What is this all about? It's like, let's think about ways that this can actually be manifest in things that maybe you're not thinking about all the time. And I hope that in kind of trying to look at medicine as sort of being used as an implement of power on some sort of groups, and particularly to this point of those who have had vaccination forced upon them in colonized spaces, or have actually been used as guinea pigs, who've actually been subjected to things where it's like not thoroughly vetted yet. Yeah, I think these are the kinds of conversations one wants to have in terms of public health, but I think also to some degree in the maybe more narrowed clinical setting. And so, yeah, I mean, perhaps it's very naive of me, but I do hope that in continuing to like talk to clinicians, or at least ones that are interested in talking to me, I'm like, I'm interested to talk to you if you're interested to talk to me, then maybe something, maybe something will stick, and it's maybe something worth them thinking about as they go about their practice.
If I might follow up on that, and Claire, feel free to pull it back to sort of the script if this is getting too far down this road. But I have to agree with Rana that this is a moment when historians can play an important role in dialogue with people in the STEM disciplines, with journalists, and with medical professionals. Historians are being asked their opinion a lot more in the last 10 years in general. But also within the medical profession, the rise of narrative medicine, I think makes us more interesting and more of a resource than perhaps before. And that's reflected in the decision, I think it was in 2012 or 2013, the MCATs added a third part to the exam, which is very humanities heavy. And you can see this in med school admissions too. I know a couple of med schools that have like separate admissions tracks for humanities majors, and they give them a crash course in organic chemistry and so forth, and then integrate them with the more traditional med school students. And the final indicator of this is so we just are coming off of Disability Month, and there is, since about 2008, 2010, there has been this sort of tag team presentation going around the country, mostly to grand rounds in medical schools, between Matthew Winia, who was formerly the director of medical ethics for the AMA, and Patricia Haber, who is the senior historian at the Holocaust Museum, specializing in medical history. And this has been going on for like a dozen years, and they still have constant requests to speak, and physicians are really, really interested in the history of their own profession, and of the cautionary tales that it entails and so forth. So I think, sorry, that's just a long way of saying, yeah, what Rana said, there's reason to be optimistic that we can play a positive, not just be heard, but play an actual positive role in this contemporary discourse.
Yeah, just to add to that, from my own experience being at Cedars-Sinai, was that, and especially we had Sari Altschuler out to talk about medical humanity. Yeah, wonderful. To talk about medical humanities and the importance of it in medical education. And I got the sense of two things, is that, yeah, I am optimistic too. I also got the sense that medical students feel, there's the one thing, which is that medical students feel like they already have to take so many classes, right? That they have, their workloads are incredible. And then there was another thing that I'm not quite sure how, it'll be interesting to see how this is reconciled, which is that the two sort of postures between the humanities disciplines and the sciences are really different. Like, our disciplines prioritize epistemological humility. Well, like, we kind of know, but we have to interpret from the source, and et cetera. And the sciences, the currency in the sciences is certainty, right? Because that's how things happen. That's how you have, especially in medicine, that's why how you have, you assure people who are anxious and nervous. We all want certainty. And so it'll just be really interesting to see how those two different methods of working are reconciled as medical students are exposed to the medical humanities. And in turn, the medical, in turn, humanists, I think humanities people have had a lot of, we've taken in biology and virology for a really long time, especially those of us who are working on epidemics. And in some ways that did help us to make really grounded claim, really be really sure about the claims that we were making about epidemic diseases and its effects upon people who are difficult to locate in the archives. On the other hand, I like that we're all going back and questioning the certainty of those assumptions made 10 years ago or so. Okay, so I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that, but I just think that there's these two different systems of set of values at play, too, that is, it's creating a little bit of noise in that translation. And I'm just not quite sure how to reconcile that.
Can I just add, so I really feel that statement, Claire, just because like there is the certainty of what science, so Illinois is very heavy like engineering and like precision and innovation we're gonna do. And it's like, for me, I always have to say, medicine and particularly, and again, it's the historian of medicine, Hippocrates, it's the art. There is, the whole point is that you are trying to, the idea is that if you make a prognostication, right, it's like, okay, you have to be really careful, right? If you say, okay, the patient is going to die and they end up living, you're a bad doc. They're not going to say, okay, you saved me. It's going to be like, you don't know what you're talking about. So you kind of have to recognize, like, there's this sense of how you frame what medicine is and its evolution. And I think that that's part of the issue, is that if we look at the early beginnings, it was the art, and physicians were kind of not highly regarded as always knowing what they were doing, as we can see from plenty of like archival sources. But I would also say that I think now there has been this impulse to say, I would argue with the development and training and formalization of what is Western biomedicine, and people have an expectation that, yes, if I go to the doctor, I want an answer. I want you to tell me what it is, and I want you to fix it, and that's the end of the story. But I do think that medicine is more complicated than that. And I think that I would actually argue is a lot of what the tension is, at least looking at discussions of the pandemic, right? Where people demand, I want to know exactly what it is. And I always have to remind people, this is a very new disease. Like smallpox, they're like, okay, we conquered smallpox, that disease has been around for a very long time. COVID-19, as far as we know, right, what it is still kind of fresh. And I remember it was the novel coronavirus at one point. And like, I just remember and remind myself where I'm like, okay, I'm pretty impressed that there's like vaccines. I'm pretty impressed that we're taking this pace, but I still think there are folks that say, nobody knows what they're doing. I don't trust anybody. Why should I? They can't give me a straight answer. One day they say, wear a mask, don't wear a mask. So I think that there's a tension between what the public perception is about medicine and its precision, and maybe what the humanities are supposed to reflect, where they'll say, okay, well, that's less precise. Like, this is other people's ideas. I think we're very precise as much as we can be. And then I think there's a sense, though, within the profession, right, where certain generations of practitioners, where maybe they're thinking, look, maybe it is okay if there's a gray area, and that we have to recognize and be comfortable and just know how to message correctly and understand the stakes of what we say and the fact that knowledge evolves. And perhaps there are others that say, look, I came here to just do what I need to do and I want an answer. So I think you're right to point out these tensions there about like sort of precision or, kind of letting there be uncertainty. And that maybe also plays out in the humanities. Who knows? I don't want to make a broad generalization or anything.
I think that was really really helpful. And oh, sorry, I had two thoughts and I just lost the first one. But the second one is about precision, and this is where I would actually think that it's a really interesting time in medicine, and there's a division happening where I actually think there is a branch of medicine and medical research that actually thinks it's very close, right, to being as precise as we can be, right? And that's the field is now called precision medicine, right, which is about making treatments not to diseases, but treatments to individuals, right? So immunotherapy, for example, in cancer, that's what it is. And in fact, even more like really now cutting edge cancer treatments, which are not about, treating cancer, but treating like this person's cancer specifically and making a medicine specifically for that individual that will not work on another individual, right? And this is, so I think it's going to be really interesting in the next, things change so fast year to year, but in the next 10 years to think about how our understanding of medicine, both within the field of medicine and in the general public works. I remembered my first thought, which was the failure, I think, Rana, that you were talking about, is as much as anything, it's a failure of us, of the public, to understand what the scientific method is, right? And when you say, I want to know the answer, but the scientific method is predicated on being wrong a lot of the time. If you're not wrong, it doesn't work. And so when we think about the messaging over the first, in February 2000, March 2000, April, May, et cetera, like, do we use masks? Do we not use masks? Those are all very complicated questions, and the answer was changing rapidly due to a number of factors, all of which are, again, fundamental to demonstrating how the process works. But it doesn't necessarily give us the answers we want, which is, am I going to live? What do I have to do?
Yeah, I wondered if we could come back, as a sort of adjacent to that really quickly before we turn to questions, about the necessity of care work and the sort of place of care work in this relationship, this dialogue about precision and the interest in certainty. And then, sorry, I was looking at the chat for a second. The relationship of care work to this other paradigm that really wants to prioritize certainty, or even certainty even with individualization, with precision medicine. And I'm just thinking about the ways in which, as Erica pointed out earlier, these epidemics are these moments of political and social disorder or challenges to like large power authorities. And oftentimes in my own experience, what they reveal is in all this interest in the people in charge in clamping down on rituals and care work and forms of like restoring people from illness that are vernacular, is that these epidemics actually didn't reveal all this stuff about what's going on in the all this stuff from the archive that would otherwise be really obscure to us through officials' efforts to eradicate them, because they've decided that that is a mechanism for the transmission of disease. And I wondered if you guys had similar experiences of locating care work or its variety of form through officials' efforts to stamp it out once the cause of transmission has been identified or has been localized or been identified as existing in particular medical practices that are common among lay people. That was a kind of complicated question, but I think we understand the gist of it, hopefully.
So I think that this notion partly, so I agree with you, and I think it draws on this long historiographical precedent of thinking about epidemics as I'm trying to remember who it is who says who worked on cholera, right? So the notion that it's a flash of lightning that reveals the working of society, rather than it might exacerbate existing things, but it doesn't necessarily create things. And so why they're so useful to historians, right? It lets us uncover these things. But I also like, Clara, it made me think of this notion of illicit forms of caring and healthcare. I was thinking partly, there's a really wonderful part that I found in my British soldiers where they're being nursed by Catholic nuns. And then the authorities are very upset because apparently they're running off and getting married after the nursing. And of course, it's a nice kind of point about the microcosm of what the healthcare system requires, which is this intimacy, right? And this way, I was thinking Mary Fussell talking about body work and whatnot. So how you can get into these and kind of access these intimate relationships that very often, precisely as you say, cross these boundaries. And it's something that I'm very struck by, right? I think we all work on periods in which, in some ways, medical expertise and authority is not yet fully established, and in some ways political authority is not yet fully established, which is precisely why then, to me, it's a kind of delight to be able to see when things are running underneath in these other currents, and precisely these disease crises make them more apparent. So it is like catching these moments of intimacy in the historical record.
Yeah, I like this notion of intimacy because, okay, Cristobal, do you want to speak to this? No? Oh, just thumbs up. We're all on board with intimacy. And especially because so much of those intimacy, like I love that they then married the women who were nursing them, if I got that right. Because it reaffirms the way so much, and it brings together the way that so much of care work and lay forms of healing or illicit forms of healing are bound up in the formation of community and affective ties, and the ways in which what the processes that Rana was talking about are sort of a major disruption of that, to just sort of only focus on the lesion, only focus on the disease. So, and I think that comes up in your work too, right? The ways that sickness, in some ways that you said at the beginning of this talk, that sickness in some ways affects family formation, fertility, and the ways and Hawaiian sovereignty as well. So those are just some thoughts to throw out there about the sort of medicalization disrupting these other means of solidifying and elaborating affective relationships between people.
I don't know if you could call it a kind of care work, but I'll offer just one other example that might be a more surprising example than people have heard, which is that In the 1830s, the indigenous communities in Central North America that I'm studying right now were very enthusiastic about vaccination and actually took it up as a practice themselves, shared it with their kin and allies, expressed in no uncertain terms a desire for herd immunity. I know the reviewers will flag that term when I try to use it in a publication, but that's exactly what they're talking about. They say we need a critical mass of our people to have this technology so that we don't get smallpox again. So it's not care work in the sense that you usually think of it, but I'm starting to think of it that way.
Well, thank you. This discussion has opened up so many unexpected, I thought the discussion was going to go one way, but it's opened up so many unexpected avenues into thinking about, I think as Cristobal summarized it, medicine as a way of thinking about constituting community and forming identities among groups, I think is, if I'm paraphrasing you right. So I think now we'll open it up to questions in the chat briefly for about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back to the conveners to talk about what you're reading now and what's been helpful for you to, how that's been helpful for you to think with. Ryan, do you want to read some questions?
Yeah, great. We have a number of really interesting questions in the chat. I thought I'd start with a question from Susan Peabody, distinguished scholar of medicine from Washington State, who many people probably know. I will read her question and ask if folks want to address it. She writes the following: in the shifting sands of medical knowledge and practice, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, cultural healing knowledge, particularly by indigenous, African, and folk sources, and even aims of medicine, how does one set down the epistemological terms of a particular case study without merely adopting the terms of the archive at face value? Maybe another way of saying this is, are there particularly works that do this exceptionally well? So a question about epistemological terms, I think it connects to some of the early parts of this conversation. We were particularly thinking about subaltern peoples. But so how do we approach this as scholars of the past? Cristobal, do you want to take this one on? I'm thinking about epistemology here and thinking about your work first and foremost, and then we'll open it to others too.
This actually made me think of something actually in the 17th century, and I'm thinking about sort of the early going back to early New England, which I haven't thought about for a while, and something that has really helped me recently. We were talking about reading, is kind of reading more Native American studies work, and work by Native American scholars in particular. And really what it is it taught me to be respectful of all the stories that the subjects tell and to take their knowledge seriously. I think that's the most important thing. Like, people know what they're talking about. Their medical models might not be the medical models that we would use, but they made sense to them. And that, I think, is a way to really recapture especially some of the indigenous knowledge we encounter, right? So, and this, I was taught, I think, in conversation with Matt Cohen. So when William Bradford writes about indigenous people in New England seeing the 17-year locust cicadas coming out of the ground, right? If you read the Bradford's journal, if you read the footnotes, the scholarly footnotes to Bradford's journal, all of those are completely dismissive. But if you ask really basic questions and accept that knowledge, that association with the 17-year locusts with smallpox or with plagues by indigenous people, all of a sudden those narratives begin to make a lot of sense, and they teach us something very powerful about indigenous epistemes, about circulation in the world, and about their understanding and knowledge of migration. So that's what I would say, is just really just assuming that people know what they're talking about. Yeah.
Seth, do you want to weigh in on this one? Thinking about particularly indigenous understandings. Think about your work here too.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. Learning to read the Hawaiian language was critical to my book. The sources were very surprising. I was able to suggest that a sort of fatalism pervaded the Hawaiian population at a certain point that had been earlier discussed as a Hawaiian Great Awakening, that is a conversion to Christianity. I described it instead, somewhat cheekily, I will admit, as a great fatalism, but that's what the sources told me. And in fact, the sources told me that it was Hawaiians who were encouraging Protestant missionaries to think in these fatalistic terms about the Hawaiian population, rather than the other way, which is what historians have typically talked about when it comes to indigenous disease and population loss. So yes, that was utterly critical to my own study. I think I'll leave that there.
Others? Rana, what do you think?
So I wish I've revisited it a little bit, but like I'm going to just briefly mention dirt eating, if I may. Cachexia africana, just because so that was presented, and I think I, at first read it simply as pathology, right? Like I'm like, okay, this is because I was actually adopting the Western biomedical gaze of these white practitioners. But in revisiting dirt eating for like a little chapter thing I'm working on, I noticed that James Thompson, who's this Anglo physician who's lived amongst the slaves in Jamaica, who knows, he comments that pregnant enslaved women are like the culprits. They will eat clay, they'll eat this dirt, and they will do it with relish, and that, they don't hide it. It sets a bad example. But the reality is, of course, is that we now know this, but eating dirt, and perhaps it was also known then, and that's what I'm trying to like wrap my mind around, is that it relieves indigestion and heartburn. And that what was perceived as a pathology from the white biomedical gaze was actually something that enslaved pregnant women understood as a way to help deal with this discomfort they were feeling. And so, and what interestingly, so it's I shouldn't say dirt, it's actually kind of clay, a specific kind of clay that is prepared in a certain way. So it's not, I don't want to give this idea of just eating a mouthful of dirt. But in reading that source, and again, this was sort of, again, the aside, right? It's like, let me tell you about this disease. Let me give you the etiology or what I think it is, why it's a problem. And it was always from the perspective of why it was a problem for planters and why it was a problem for physicians. And of course, they're interested in pathology, but I actually have been thinking of various ways to read things like dirt eating or Cachexia africana as saying, okay, it can be a deliberate thing, it can be resistance, it can be ameliorative. It's something that helps them for enslaved women doing this. And so in terms of thinking about, this kind of knowledge and how it's commented on, for me, I had to kind of reread that again and really start to think broadly and kind of fall into a few rabbit holes about clay eating, which is something that transpired in antiquity. It is something that was done in ancient Greece. It had a number of specific medical and religious purposes. So to kind of say, I need to kind of, disabuse myself of this idea that it must purely be pathology because that's what my sources tell me. So I think that, that has been a great experience for me. And I think just to the point in terms of like what you would want to read or sort of having that as an assignment, right? To say, okay, what are the multiple ways we look at this report on a disease and how it's constructed and what is the main issue for the author? Okay, well, what else is going on? Who are the people that are doing it? And what do they maybe reveal, like as a hint or a tell in something that they just think is a detail, but actually has something far greater meaning that would seek to, I would argue, not like show us, but amplify the presence of the marginalized, or in this case, enslaved women, as being completely active and knowing how to manage their bodies. They know how to manage their health. So yeah, I don't know if that helps or answers the question.
That's great. I'm thinking I'll give a callback to a couple of our other panelists from before, but I think of Pablo Gomez's work on enslaved peoples in Latin America, right? And people of African descent and sort of the centrality of experience. I also think about Martha Few's work. I think Martha might still be in the audience here, thinking about sort of the roles of magical remedies as well. I'm going to ask, there's another really interesting question from Michael Picone, and I'll just read it. In an unplanned way, at least initially, mosquito-borne illnesses, like malaria and yellow fever, actually empowered African origin communities in at least one region in the Americas. These diseases contributed to isolation and subsequent semi-self-management of slaves on rice plantations in the low country in South Carolina and Georgia. Since white planters did not want to live in wetter areas where the plantations were located in order to avoid infection. This led to the maintenance of linguistic and cultural Africanisms in the Low Country to a higher degree than elsewhere. Anybody know of other examples about this? Anybody want to pick apart some of this, thinking about the distinctions here of different kinds of diseases? In some way, I think there's an inference here about endemic disease, in addition to epidemic disease, which sort of has come up already, but also the other way that maybe diseases can allow for some autonomy or some level of greater autonomy for different kinds of communities. Other examples folks want to raise, maybe similarly, or just on this one? And I'll throw that just out there to anyone.
I wonder, so to me, it seems like it's a broader question about how disease reinforces this notion of locality and local identity. And obviously, I feel like there's, I mean, the issue of yellow fever basically kind of defending, especially Caribbean areas from invaders comes up again and again, right? That both those who live there and those who have are trying to control them and those who then want to invade them are quite aware that disease is actually the major obstacle in the way of their kind of military and political ambitions. And I think you can see this in some, even in the kind of more so-called wilderness areas. But I think the thing that always interests me though is how, look, disease is no obstacle if you are willing to pay the price for people, right? So I suppose I'd somewhat, I always think it's interesting, right? I think this came up in the previous panel as well, but this kind of question about agency and the role of disease, because my sense is that people are quite aware of disease being a problem. And then the question is, how much of a problem is it and what are they trying to achieve? So I'm always amazed by how in the early modern period, and in some ways, you know, this is building on what Rana was saying, people are very aware of their disease environments. They understand very often the costs. They can regulate these things, but they're also willing to take certain risks, whether because of greed or ambition, or whether simply because they think other things are more important, right? So even in that context, I think disease is just one element among many that people can manipulate and exploit, and is not simply a kind of flat given for those who are presented with its problems.
Putting together two of these comments, and the second of which is Erica's phrase, you know, if you're willing to pay the price, it only really just occurred to me, so maybe I'm slow, but that so many of the places on the Gulf Coast and Atlantic coast of North America where indigenous communities have kind of held on, despite being really on the the front line of European colonization, and have held on often with extensive intermarriage with people of African descent, are in these places. You know, the Homas at the mouth of the Mississippi River, Seminoles in Florida, Lumbees in North Carolina, a really not very well known but quite substantial community of Algonquian people in parts of the Chesapeake Bay region that where malaria was most endemic, and where the soils were the poorest and so forth. And I don't know how far I have to think about this, but it kind of seems like a pattern.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions about vaccination and inoculation, just sort of synthesize them. Thinking about vaccination and inoculation as political tools. There's one question in particular about how they operate across boundaries, potentially national and imperial. But anybody want to sort of reflect? I think there's a lot of conversation, as we no doubt know, about vaccination and politics, but I wonder how we might think about this in the earlier periods, 18th century in particular.
It's definitely being used as a military tool. I would say look, inoculation, I think in the 18th century army, it always strikes me soldiers or some of the earliest groups that you experiment on, right? And it's a kind of interesting trend. Obviously, you can think about, there's all sorts of pragmatic reasons why, but definitely for the 18th century wars and the British and French army, they're thinking about using this as an extra level of protection because it's a kind of military strategy, right? To think about different groups within society. So it strikes me that, of course, inoculation vaccination has a long history of being a political activity as much as it is purely one about securing health. And so I think for the second question that was kind of asking about the relationship of trust and distrust to the government authorities, it strikes me that of course you can see why depending on who is offering you this medical service will change it rather than the actual medical activity. I mean, I've been very struck by this notion of historical sympathies. So I think as social historians, when I read in the historical record, and obviously we're talking about in some ways a completely different kind of operation, even for vaccination in the 19th century than what we're talking about today. But as historians, you have a kind of sympathy for people because I think generally we're social historians, and so we're interested in those who are rebelling against authority. And so we tend to focus on those groups who are resisting what they see as some of these impositions. And I'm struck by how we kind of square that then with our position today. And this is one of the things that's made me think a lot about being a historian, right? Where we have a very different relationship. And I've noticed people who work on anti-vaccination groups in the 19th century who are very sympathetic, but of course have a very different sentiment towards those groups in society today. And so I'm always kind of curious, right? As historians, what point, where does our historical sensibilities, where do they stop? Where do they continue? Are we supposed to be treating all these groups as the same? Because it just strikes me that, of course, we're interested in different things in the historical record than we might be within our own society, and it kind of awakens our own, maybe whether we have an ethical response in the archives and what it is that we might be looking for.
Yeah, can I just say one other thing to this question about inoculation and vaccination and political authority? Is I'm always, I mean, so yeah, so that's right, states and militaries and armies and squadrons that are pushing for inoculation, and there's a sort of distrust there. But then there's also like this deep skepticism about the sort of individual commercial proprietor of inoculation, these itinerant guys who go from place to place. And that weaponizes a different language that's not about this abstract, omnipowerful state authority, but like the motivations of the individual inoculator and how that throws into question their capacity, you know, because they're self-interested, that throws into question their capacity to interpret the natural world. Now we're like, you know, I think that some of the anti-vaccination sentiment has, because we live in a world of mega pharmacy, right, of commercialized pharmacy, the proprietors of immunity remedies are seen as this almost like a state, like this huge monolithic entity that people are very nervous about. But I think in early modernity, it was individuals. But that same question about what are this person's motivations for promulgating this remedy that is yet to be vouchsafed and is really incommensurate with traditional ways of thinking about restoration, disease prevention. So it's like, it's both on states and it's on individuals too. I just wanted to add that. I think we're getting close to closing. So I wanted to ask our presenters, what are they reading right now that's helping them think about these questions and or has informed their work?
I'll mention two things. I'm fortunate enough to co-convene a working group here with Rana here and our friend Chris Willoughby at the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. The working group is on the social history of race, health, and environment, and we've had a series of wonderful works in progress that you can see by going to that website. And then I'll just add another interesting stream of scholarship that I'm following is the work of Monica H. Green, who is using what she calls the biological archive, which is essentially paleogenetic research. Monica has just argued that the Black Death broke out a century before we knew, that it followed a different course across Central Asia, that it played a part in Mongol imperial expansion, including the sacking of Baghdad. These seem like important developments, and I think we should keep an eye on them.
I will jump in really quickly. I'm also like in the consortium working group, so I'm reading lots of really cool works in progress. My mind is in a lot of places because I'm in like the race and then slavery and then the history of medicine. I am excited about Maladies of Empires with Jim Downs' book just came out, and this is very much related to my own very selfish reasons of sort of being like I don't think that you know, put it this way, I think that I enjoy my training as a historian of medicine, and I enjoy reading some of the medical treatises that I do, but I've always been a person that's like, I want to know where you got the information and where's the footnotes and what is the incidental aside. And so just digging into a little bit of Jim's work is showing me that these incidental aside, like these places are where some of the knowledge is coming from, and it's being derived from prisoners, from enslaved people, from like the kind of people that are often left out of the big histories of disease and epidemiology and history of medicine. And so I'm quite interested in digging into that, because something that I do that I continually habitually do is I'm like a paper trail rabbit hole person where I'm like, really, this is your footnote? Well, where did that come from? And you dig down and you dig down, and I'm like, this happened because of, you know, an incident on a plantation. I'm like, okay, so, but they kind of somehow get dropped out of the big splash of like what I've discovered or what I've found. Much in the same way of like thinking about like, you know, there was a question about diseases and sort of Africanisms, and sort of, I was thinking of yaws, which is a disease that Western physicians were like, no, get away. And you know, how much sort of lack of surveillance does that mean for enslaved Africans that they could try and work on their own cures? And I think Londa Schiebinger mentions this really interesting bit in Secret Cures of Slaves of like a competition between like a Western physician and the enslaved healer, and like whose remedy will work. And in some ways it's like, okay, I'm giving it sort of simplifying, but in some ways I'm really curious about knowledge that is coming from these groups of people being pitted against Western biomedicine in the first place, but also just sort of to say that any book that is looking at these, what I want to say, just sort of the debris of from marginalized and subjugated groups, and saying that this is actually not debris, this is the foundation and basis of bigger things to come, is always interesting to me. So I am reading Jim Downs's Maladies of Empire now, and then I've been struggling to start all these other reading projects. I really wanted to read Jennifer Morgan's book, but also Vincent Brown's book, which I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like, so I have a list that keeps growing.
Yeah, the list keeps growing for sure. I'm in a strange position for a number of reasons, but you know, it's an exciting time to be working in the field that we're working, but it's also such like burnout, just thinking nonstop all the time about medicine. I want to pick up on a reference that James made much earlier about narrative medicine, which I think is a really important field. But the field I've been drawn, so I'm going to say field more than books right now, drawn towards kind of an adjacent to narrative medicine, and that's graphic medicine. And in particular, one of the things I'm drawn to that because of my own turn toward caregiving and thinking about caregiving practices in sort of on a number of registers, ethical registers included. So I'm reading sort of across the field in graphic medicine, but again, it's a high burnout. It's a high burnout field right now. I'm tired of thinking about illness for all kinds of reasons. So I'm sorry, it's kind of like a wishy-washy answer, but I think given partly also our job as teachers and what we face with our students every day, it's kind of.
I can go. I should confess that it's in some ways it's a boring answer, and as Claire and Brian mentioned, because I'm running this project on how epidemics end, and so we're just putting together the special issue. So I've mostly been reading a lot of submissions, but including Paul Kelton's, who's speaking at the last session, who talks about kind of non-ending. And one of the things I have to say, which I've loved about this project, is because there's about 20 people writing different things on how an epidemic ends, and they're from all disciplines. So it's, you know, reading mathematical modelers, how they define it. But one of the really nice things is that I have been free to just contact people and say, that epidemic that you work on, how did it end? And then you get into these email discussions and you read their work and they say, oh, that's, you know, I hadn't thought about this. So I had this really nice conversation with Marta Hansen. So I've been reading her speaking of epidemics in Chinese medicine, and thinking especially about a kind of pre-19th century context of why cyclical natures of epidemics. And so trying to think about different ways of ending. And so there's a kind of joy I found in reading things that I probably should have read many years ago, and now have the freedom to kind of browse through and just be like, here, let me pick this up and think through one topic. So the list does get longer, and I entirely agree too with Christabel in terms of the kind of exhaustion. But it's also, I found it liberating to read things that I would never otherwise feel that I need to do for my own research, and just out of curiosity.
Okay, James, did you want to go ahead, jump in?
Just very briefly, I've been chairing the department during the pandemic, and also Happier Things through a bunch of promotions and tenure cases. And so reading sounds like that would be really nice. But I am working on a synthesis of indigenous environmental history in North America, from Oaxaca to the Arctic, and first human habitation to the present, and just coming up on the 15th century. And so I've been stockpiling works in anticipation. And also I've been on a prize committee for the American Society for Environmental History, which means that some of those titles are on my shelves. And what I'm really, you know, a synthesis like this, it's a process of reading 5 books, then writing a sentence, and then repeating. But what I'm really stockpiling and looking forward to are a couple of areas. One is sort of, catching up on Pacific histories, Pacific facing histories. Seth's book has been on my shelf for a while, completely undamaged, but there's a time to read that. Going all the way back to 2009, I think, Linda Newsom's Conquest and Pestilence on the early Philippines. And then zooming really up to the present, where people in indigenous communities are facing public health problems that are often, metaphorically at least, cast as epidemics, as plagues, diabetes being the primary one. And getting back into the field and doing field work again, and looking at, in selected areas, indigenous historicities that help people in these communities to think about how to better their public health in, you name the community specific ways. So I'm actually getting, excited about getting back into the field and out of the archives, and, out there with the boots on. So.
Wonderful. Okay, I unfortunately have to draw this really stimulating conversation to a close. I was so pleased the way it both mirrored and went in different directions than the December 3rd meeting. Thank you so much to our speakers. Ryan and I can't say enough about how much we appreciate your time and your flexibility in getting this together and coming, making time from your busy schedules and accommodating that this is on Eastern Standard Time. Some of you are in the UK. So just thank you for participating and for contributing to our understanding of infectious diseases across the early modern Americas and the Pacific and Atlantic worlds. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, and Brian and Claire and Martha and everyone for putting this together, which has been, these 2 events have been wonderful. I'm looking forward to the next.